Hi, and welcome to another Kintsugi Conversations. I'm Rob Balfour,
And I'm Neva Rose.
and this evening we're speaking to Richard Barber. And I've known Richard longer than he probably thinks I've known him indirectly. I'm thinking about this the other day. I actually met Richard in 2000, I think it was 2009. And Richard attended a conference at Bradford University that I organised called Invisible Boys. And it was about male survivors, and it was a kind of very keynotey kind of thing. And we had some Australian survivors and an Australian project and also a psychiatrist, all sorts of people. And Richard attended when he was wearing a hat for another organisation. But Richard now works for Visible, and I won't say anything about that. I'll hand over to Richard so he can tell us a little bit about what he now does in relation to working with sexual violence change.
Thanks very much. I do remember that conference very well. It was a really, really interesting day. I learned a lot from it. Yeah. So back then I was working for a really good organisation in Leeds called Leeds Survival Ed Crisis Service, and we were seeing a lot of people, mainly women, but we saw a lot of male survivors as well, presenting with suicidality, self-injury, all sorts of things, but with some kind of trauma at the background. It often was sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse often. And from that, I've kind of moved up a bit, and now I'm working for Visible, which is just my dream job in many ways. So it's really a cross-sector partnership funded through the ICB, the Integrated Care Board, aimed at improving health and well-being outcomes for adults who've experienced childhood sexual abuse. And that's the beauty of it. It's as long and broad and deep as that. And anything and everything we can think of to do that is on the table. So that's what I'm bringing tonight.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening and giving up your time to chat to us about all things strategy change and activism for survivors and their allies. So it's really good to speak to you, Richard, because Leeds, people don't probably think about it much in West Yorkshire, but Leeds is like the fourth largest city in the United Kingdom. So it's not a small city; it's a very complex city with a large population, probably the largest population in all of West Yorkshire, and so it has a kind of pivotal place in transformation of anything really, because it leads the way often. Even though other localities in West Yorkshire are doing their thing, Leeds is a centre of opportunity for change often, isn't it? Because of its size and its ability to look at things differently and its diverse challenges. Would you agree that that's kind of what you're seeing change?
Yeah. I mean, when I came into sort of mental health, it was when this survival-led service was getting set up, so it seemed like the norm for me. It was like there's a culture. It was like people who'd had their own experience of mental health crisis and long stays in psychiatric institutions, and so I wanted to do something different. So it always seemed to me, the angle I kind of came into the system, that change, it was all about change and trying to do things differently. And because, Leeds just does have a pretty vibrant culture, I think it's a really cool city. And it's always felt like, people have been willing to do things a little bit differently. And as frustrated as I've got with the system many, many times over the years, when and I do spend quite a bit of time in other parts of the country, I feel like Leeds in a lot of ways is kind of ahead of the curve. It's got a lot of things it needs to do better, but there's always been a willingness to do things a little bit differently in Leeds, I think.
I mean, I can take it now because we've operated services across Leeds for 25 years, one way or the other. Just we've done it as a West Yorkshire West Yorkshire kind of service, where the kind of people contact us from the Leeds area. So we kind of do. What I've seen for Leeds is when you actually look what's on the ground for people, it is pioneering in many ways. So, the Leeds Survivor-led service, for instance, was a pioneer of kind of peer support kind of systems in many ways for people, wasn't it? So it's kind of out there doing things. And it was safe spaces rather than institutional spaces. It was more kind of safe and big sofas where you could sit down rather than clinical spaces where you had to sit on plastic chairs and things.
Yeah.
It was, and that was, we don't think anything about that now. We expect that to see that. But when 20 years ago or whatever, that was not normal. It was like a very different way of doing things. And Leeds kind of did that. So Leeds has led the way on a lot of stuff. And there's other stuff as well that I can think of that it's done over the years, I'm sure. So Leeds is a centre, difficult environment, isn't it, with all the financial pressures. And there's a lot of deprivation, a lot of wealth in Leeds, a lot of deprivation in Leeds as well. So a lot of things, child protection issues,
Yeah.
some of the highest suicide, in fact, it's the second highest suicide rate, I think, in the United Kingdom. So the latest figures.
Yeah.
So, and they've gone up. So all of that is kind of there for you to the backdrop. And we know that survivors are 10 times likely not to take their own lives, male survivors in particular, but female survivors are not far behind. They're just not as good at achieving the final outcome as males are.
Yeah.
So, so you have all of those things going on. So it's a complex picture, but also hopeful, isn't it, Leeds? And so tell us about the work that you're doing with Visible, because a lot of people won't know, have heard of Visible in the sense of, and the way it's trying to focus change within, we call them systems, don't they? Whether your GP surgery, it's your mental health secondary service, it's your counselling service. It's all the stuff that the state provides to alleviate human distress often in a city like Leeds.
Yeah. I mean, the great thing about Visible is it's like a bit of a blank canvas. I mean, one starting point where I come into it from is if you look at the, the stats, we know that sadly 1 in 4 girls, is likely to experience sexual abuse before the age of 16, and 1 in 6 boys. And if you crunch numbers, you're looking at about 50,000 adults in Leeds have experienced child sexual abuse. I mean, that's just phenomenal, and it speaks to the scale of the challenge, because this is just a sort of an invisible issue, And we were sort of chatting before we started recording about how little you can have flashpoints of people seeing something, but then it kind of goes away again. And I think people just don't really want to engage with it, and I understand that. So with Visible, the clues in the title, it was about making it more visible. Making survivors feel that they could be visible and say, this is what I need and this is what's happened to me. Being able to tell a story and empower themselves in that way and ask for what they really need. And it's about making the issues much more visible to people in the services. So we do all sorts of things. I mean, I sort of break it down into 2 main strands. One is system change, because we know that systems have to change. Because, look at another good example I like to use. NHS England say they want to eliminate cervical cancer by, I don't know if it's 2030, 2050 or something. It seems like an achievable aim. But they're just offering a one-size-fits-all approach. There's no thought, seemingly, into well, actually, if you're a survivor of sexual abuse, sexual violence, you're really not going to want to go into some kind of intimate health check in that kind of setting. So why is it just a one-size-fits-all approach? So we're chipping away at that, thinking about how GP practices can, adapt practice and upskilling GPs, and not just GPs, nurses, and even admin teams, receptionists need to know about this stuff, because somebody can walk in, or they can pick the phone up and ring, and if they just get somebody that's just a bit resistant, well, I can't offer you any flexibility, this is just how the system works, fine, I won't bother. So it's very obvious, you can see this kind of system change that needs to happen there in terms of physical healthcare, in mental health. We're doing a whole heap of work with the Leeds Community Mental Health Transformation around leading on, making sure the system's trauma-informed, because the culture is just not there around, being curious about, well, why is this person suicidal? Why are they self-injuring? Why are they shouting at me down the phone? It's not just because of a mental health diagnosis, it's because something's happened to them to make them like that. So system change is one big aspect that takes up a lot of my time, and the other is really just sort of changing societal culture, really. So empowering survivors, and just noticing survivor isn't everybody's favourite word, but because some people think they haven't survived yet and so on, but we'll just use that as shorthand. But giving survivors, creating spaces for people to come together and find the words, what's happened to them amongst peers, have to see themselves reflected back, changing the narrative a little bit, just improving the quality of the conversation around childhood sexual abuse, which nobody wants to talk about, but it's just this hidden epidemic of sexual violence going on kind of silently, and some people just don't even really understand the extent or the nature of it. And again, like I say, I understand people not wanting to really grapple with it, but it's got to happen. And just trying to improve the quality of that conversation and develop ways to talk about it that people can actually really engage with and get to grips with, and just making, well, it comes back to the word visible, making it visible.
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, a lot of that I can kind of relate to in relation to change. We get referrals from some GP practices across West Yorkshire, and they're regular. Others we never hear anything from. So presumably they have no survivors whatsoever of disclosure windows. Some are very good at picking up and dealing with survivor disclosures. But I think that what it, for me is, we were talking about this, weren't we? Or another point, which is, how do you get people to buy into the change? So survivors need to be involved in that change, because clearly they're not disordered. They're not kind of limited beings. They're just human beings who have been traumatized and have really adapted as well as they can. And systems are often kind of engage with them very, very easily because of they want them to conform. But of course, by forcing them to conform, what you're doing is repeating what the abuser did in some ways. You're making them do things that they don't feel they want to do, and that triggers them. But there is a GP, I don't know if you're aware, there's a GP practicing, I believe, in North London, surgery in North London, that has been dealing with sexual violence change service for their patients for a few years now, and actually been leading the way. And they actually did a talk at the London ACE Hub the other day. That was kind of I don't know if you're aware of that. So, there's case studies for how this is already happening. That people, and it's being led by individuals, often the senior partners in GP surgeries in this particular example, who gets it and wants to change their entire practice, not just to deal with gynecological issues, which are very important to deal with, but actually deal with the whole holistic way that they engage with disclosure of childhood sexual abuse within their patient population. Because often, a lot of the somatic stuff that's coming to doctors, and seemingly, I forget what the stats are, is around 40 to 60%, depending wherever, each week of presentations. There is no etiological cause. They can't find anything. There's nothing there. They can scan forever and they can't find it. So they put it down to psychological or somatic. And often, if a woman, female or male, is coming and kind of complaining constantly of hip pain, but there's no arthritis, there's no indications that there are any blood iron issues, there's nothing to see. You have to say, what is creating the hip issue? Constant pain, discomfort. Are they getting around and exercising? Yes, I jog, I do all these things. So what is it? And in the end, when they actually do they've done a history, they found that woman or that male would have experienced rape as a child. And what's happening is the stress is manifesting itself in their hips, because it was their hips that they felt that's where the trauma was. It's going into the body. So that's called somatic, isn't it? And a lot of people don't really understand that asking the question might start to alleviate a lot of these somatic issues that take up 40 to 60% of the capacity of the surgery every week. This is one example of it. But these people, there are people doing it though. Leeds is doing it. So I know the surgery practice that you're talking about, they're doing it, aren't they? Others are doing it in pockets. It's just getting that, for me, I think, I don't know what your view of it is, and Neve will have a view of it as well as a young person, is getting systems to kind of doctors and other, to kind of just speed things up with all the pressures they're under, and we all kind of are sympathetic to it all. Just speeding things up, because it's going to be better for them. It's going to be better for the patient. It's better for their services, and allow them to do more and actually really do the stuff. I've always believed, with doctors in particular, that if you really should go back to Galen and Hippocrates, and because they were telling you that actually listen to the patient. If you listen to the patient will tell you everything you need to know to work with them to make their condition better. And you can do all the potions and you can do all the kind of burning the incense and all the rest of it, but metaphorically. But actually, if you listen to them, they'll tell you what they need, and then follow them, because they're usually right. And that was not 20 years ago, 100 years ago. That was 2,500 years ago when they were saying that, because they had that wisdom, because they practiced it and had learnt it. Listen to the patient. They will tell you everything you need to know. And for some reason, especially in sexual violence, there's a kind of, there's a firewall. Don't listen to the person telling you that they were raped as a child.
Mm-hmm.
Don't listen that they were raped as an adult. Don't listen to, we're not here to deal with that, because what we're here to deal with is the fact that you've got an anxiety attack now because of it. We'll deal with the anxiety attack, but we won't talk about the fact that you were raped. And of course, it's talking about the rape that's going to alleviate the anxiety, because you can medicate the anxiety, but the anxiety is going to come back because you're not dealing with what's creating the anxiety, what's creating the depression, what's creating these issues. And until you deal with it, and I always say, go back to Galen. They always go on about Galen and Hippocrates. They're kind of like the heroes of the medical profession, aren't they, in many ways? And they're the kind of totem poles of what doctoring should be about, because they can root themselves back for 2,500 years. Thankfully, they've learned a lot, and it's good for all of us. But you kind of go back, and it was simple advice. Listen to what your patient says. Hear what they're saying. They will tell you everything you need to help. Everything you need to know to help them will come from the patient. Then you can apply all the potions and all the rest of it. But you'll do it knowing what you're doing rather than thinking you know what you're doing.
I think listening is like one of the kind of biggest challenges here as well, because it's like you get kind of conferences and people asked to come and speak to the NHS or wherever, and it's like, how do we work with these people in a trauma-informed way? But then they don't listen to what you say, and they don't implement what you say. And it's like, it is a simple solution, but it's like when you offer them that, they're like, well, we don't really understand that. And it's like they're not listening from like the very kind of core of it. So they won't listen to people in GP practices, but they also won't listen from that like system perspective, if that makes sense. I feel like just not taking on board anything, and like wanting to seem as though they are taking on board what survivors are saying, and wanting to kind of tick those boxes of like, we've spoken to this group of people, but not actually listening to what they've said and implementing what they've heard. Is that something that you've come across quite a lot working through Visible? Or do you find that people are really enthusiastic, or do you think it gets to a point and then it's like hitting a brick wall? Or what is that experience for you from the perspective of Visible?
That's a really good question. As I have spoken to dozens and dozens of people, you know, it's just sort of accelerated over the last few years about trying to implement this. And I think it speaks to the sort of central problem of, you know, how you affect change. I think the problem is, and particularly in healthcare services, they've become very mechanistic and very technocratic and very process driven, and it's all about implementing something or applying some kind of intervention. You know, what's the intervention? And it's like, well, you're the intervention. You know, it's something you hear. You know, it's been, I think, several trauma-informed practitioners have come up with some variation on, you know, the interaction is the intervention. It's just something that happens between you and another person. That's the sort of trauma-informed magic. And I think people really struggle to get their head around that. They're all there to sort of learn some kind of technique. Like they went to university to study this stuff. You have to study it and then apply something. And I think trauma-informed isn't something you do. It's something you are. You know, I've learned how to wake up in the morning and go to work and think, well, how can I manifest trauma-informed practice? How can I be a trauma-informed human? And that's something that people really struggle to get their heads around. You know, so you can have these conversations and it does feel like you go round and round and round. And a lot of people welcome it. And there won't be that resistance, but change won't happen. You know, it's like, you know, learning to, you know, to exercise properly, you know, eat properly, eat more, you know, sort of nutritionally. These are things you've got to do. You've got to dedicate yourself to it and do it over and over again. It's about consistency, it's practice. You know, you've got to practice being trauma-informed by trying to be trauma-informed at all times. You know, it's not somewhere you kind of arrive. And it's hard to explain, but it's I mean, at the risk of going off on a massive tangent, but, you know, I think you invite these kind of things in your podcasts. I know there's a book I recommended to you, Rob, a while ago, written by a psychiatrist, actually, called The Master and His Emissary, about this view that, you know, the ancient Greeks and, you know, for quite a long time, that it was the right hemisphere of the brain that kind of produced consciousness, a style of consciousness. And over time, the left hemisphere, which kind of does a lot of work on behalf of the right hemisphere in terms of figuring stuff out and grasping things and reaching for things and doing the kind of processing stuff, thinks it's got in charge. And so you've got this very mechanistic society where we're just, destroying the planet in the name of profit, and we're breaking a human being down. It's, as you said, Galen and Hippocrates, listen to the person. It was a holistic, whole body, whole mind approach, where you saw the whole person, and it was much more open to being kind of compassionate and understanding things in a whole picture and using metaphor, to understand things. And now we've come a long way from that. And now if that person goes, it's about, well, the hip, well, let's examine the hip in minute detail. Well, our machines are telling us there's nothing wrong with the hip. Whereas if you step back and see that whole kind of picture, so I sometimes feel like I've got this right hemisphere view, and I'm talking to a lot of very left hemisphere clinicians. We're doing clinical work. We've got like, look at the DSM, that started, with like maybe just a couple of hundred psychiatric, and now there's several thousand. We're just breaking the world up into smaller and smaller atomized elements, and it's stopping us from seeing the kind of big picture. So that's a roundabout way of saying that, yes, when I go into these kind of spaces and talk to people, I feel like there's, on some level, they're getting it, but they just can't make it fit this very left brain, technocratic, mechanistic view of human beings, and moving away from that, and I remember somebody saying to me, for every like 5 minutes of front-facing work when I'm actually spending time with somebody, it generates 90 minutes of like paperwork. There's all the risk assessments and the care plans and all the rest of it. And we're trying to do things in Leeds now, like to going away from that and going back to like, well, it's somebody wiser than me in Leeds said it's about making the work relational rather than transactional. And that's a good way of summing up what I'm sort of going on about at length. It's all transactional, like service user. Remember when we started calling people customers in adult social care? These are customers, It's just like as a transaction happening. You've got an issue, and I'm going to try and solve it in this transactional way. Whereas it's about saying, well, actually, let's take a moment to think about, well, what's happening in the relationship now between you and me? Because I've noticed in 5 minutes of good quality relationship, a good quality experience of relationship, somebody could go away thinking, I feel helped. I've still got my problems, but I felt listened to them. I feel just slightly a little bit unburdened, and I feel like I could go and manage the next 5 minutes of my life, and I feel all right. Or they can go away thinking I feel harmed. And that's what it really comes down to me. Just if we want to talk about change, it's changing people's mental habits, practitioners, everybody in the system. I think more like, well, am I offering this person a good quality experience of relationship that's going to make them fit, that's going to be sort of healing for them in some small way rather than harmful? That's the change that's got to come.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I did a video for the ICB some years ago for one of their, the ART, the Adversity Trauma Resilience Change Program thing, and I kind of did one. It wasn't meant to be funny, but it was a kind of it was using metaphor and using film images from Star Trek, but there was a seriousness about it for me because it was sending a message to people in the system like you've just been articulated about, this kind of left right. Which I get. I mean, I think it's far more complicated than that. But it's because I think you have agency. So it's kind of having a choice as a professional about what you do. But what is the end outcome? What is the purpose of the change? And the idea was to use metaphors, kind of illustrate it using a bit of Star Trek-y stuff because I like Star Trek, and kind of do that stuff to kind of say, well, this is what it might look like metaphorically if we change. It's not going to be starships and flying out to the edge of the universe and, giant space stations. But on a real basis inside the room of a human being, that's maybe the space you create. Is that kind of space where it's kind of the future, where it's positive and where people are seen and heard and valued and not transactional. It's a relationship that's designed to help that person to find their own solutions within the confines of that kind of unlimiting. So we're not limiting people. We're saying you are not limiting. You're just kind of waiting to find the right pathway. We'll help you to find that pathway, and we'll do it together. That's what you did when you worked for Leeds Survivor service, you are kind of helping people to discover their own pathways. And that's difficult in systems that aren't aligned with that vision because they're kind of being that transactional stuff. So I think it's kind of all of that. It's kind of doing things that actually we see the person as a human being. And when you say, how do you do trauma informed? I'd say radical empathy and remember the person in front of you is a human being.
Yeah.
And being honest.
Absolutely.
It's not cruel to be honest. It's actually people cry. They actually want to give you a hug because your first time anyone's actually been honest with them. And it may not be nice, honestly. You might say, oh, this is a load of crap. And you're going to have to struggle and it's going to be bad. But you don't have to do it on your own. And we'll work with you and we'll make sure that, we give you as much as we're able to give you so that you can make it to the other side because you can do that. That's honestly, but it's going to be rubbish. It's going to be hard. You're going to meet all these people. But we won't be like that. We'll try not to be like that. And then do it. And they kind of just, no one's ever spoken to them like that. It's kind of no one's ever been. Often they haven't met people. They've just been honest. And it's not hard, is it, to be honest?
No. I mean, I learned that from doing that kind of crisis work and realising belatedly, it took a long time, that as a male presenting, male identifying human, that's scary for a lot of women. And they might not feel able to say, oh, I don't really want to work with Richard tonight. I don't want to work with the man. They might just go along with it because they're over compliant. And the change in me just acknowledging that, it did take me a long time, and I'm sure I harmed plenty of people psychologically along the way that just sat there and just went along with it while I did my crisis support thing. And afterwards I felt, well, I didn't feel able to say, and I didn't want to sit in a room with a man. I felt scared the whole way and now I just feel twice as bad. But just acknowledging, saying, well, look, I know you've said that you're happy to work with the man. That's fine, I'm here, but I just want to acknowledge that it might be really difficult for you to be in a room with the man, and if any time you want to, just acknowledging those things, that kind of honesty, and it just raises something in the session that it brings people together. You don't have to be perfect. You can say, well, we can only offer you 6 sessions of something, in a really under-resourced, under pressure mental health service like everywhere is at the minute. But you don't have to be defensive and say, well, don't complain about it because not everybody gets that. You can say 6 sessions probably ain't going to be anywhere near enough for you. But this is where we are, what's actually like. And that kind of honesty, it creates a connection, and it's the connection that's healing. That's why one of the many reasons why I really love trauma informed practice is because you can do it under the terrible circumstances because it just does bring that honesty, And I did just want to pick up, I know I'm going to go on, but just when you were talking about using metaphor and Star Trek and stuff, in people's personal lives, what do we do when we sort of need some wisdom about how to handle relationship? We listen to music, we watch movies, we take things from there that inspire us to do stuff. If you suggested doing that in the mental health system, they'd think you were crazy. It's like, well, you could recommend going, if that person's quite hard to work with, go and listen to that album. I'll give you a few clues. You've got to read some really complicated academic article, and it just seems to me the wrong way of kind of doing it. It's about, I think change has to be coming back to that kind of way of thinking about things more holistically and interesting.
And that is human, isn't it? Because stories are the oldest form of medicine. They were told around campfires in the plains of Africa or wherever we generated as a species because we had a desire to share stories with people. Because stories give us connection, they give us a sense of meaning, they give us a sense of healing. Because if we've been on the hunt and we've gone out and some of our hunter colleagues had been killed by that mammoth, we missed them because they were related to us or they were our friends. And we wanted to tell the story around the fire and how they were heroes and they died with meaning, trying to bring food to the tribe and all of that. So actually it's the same so they were healing themselves with the story. So what we have lost is the ability to have the healing story with people who are coming back from the metaphorical bison hunt or wherever where they've been damaged by some crazed tiger, who's kind of tried to hurt them, and how they've survived that. And we've just lost the ability to sit with them and to validate their experience of the tiger. and the death of their friends or their innocence or wherever. And we kind of want to say, well, actually, you just need to go back and not think about that and not have any emotion about it and don't worry about it and all these things. But actually, our natural instinct is to tell the story, is to be. So survivors don't want to be in silence. I've never met a survivor who's ever said to me, I really like the silence. I don't want to stay. I want to go back. They don't like the results that they get sometimes when they tell, because the responses can be a load of crap. Often, and even now, they're a load of crap. We hear it a lot too much. But I've never heard any survivor who said, I want to go back into silence because they like the silence. They want to go back because the responses have been not good. But they hated the silence because it was a trap. And they realized they wanted to tell their story. They wanted to be heard, seen, and validated. And not in a kind of there, now kind of way. They wanted to have someone just hear and see them for who they really are. As amazing human beings who've endured things that most people, frankly, can't imagine. So I think stories are a key part of beginning to understand how you practice with people. And they can be individual, one-to-one storytelling, but they can also be that collective storytelling. And if you know Rufus May pioneered a lot of that stuff in Hearing Voices stuff, where you'd sit around and they would share and kind of stories, and it's kind of almost tribal, isn't it? It's kind of going back to that sense of community that sits around the fire and tells each other stories about, many of the things that they've experienced during the day or during the hunt or during the winter and all these type of things, so they can heal and grow together.
You also highlighted something that I think you might not have even realised that you did, but you kind of said, in the past, I might have done something that's caused harm, and I've learnt from it, and this is what I do. And I think that is something that people don't acknowledge at all. And I think especially systems are almost like terrified to say, actually, I hold my hands up, or we hold our hands up as a system, we've done something to cause harm, and we're going to try rectify that now. I think it is very difficult sometimes, especially for like big organisations or systems or whatever, to say, yeah, we've made this big error, because there's going to be repercussions of that. People are going to come forward and say, actually, yeah, you have caused harm. But I think that ability to say, yes, I have made a mistake in the past, but this is what I'm doing, and I understand that I did that wrong, and this is what I'm doing now to make sure I don't do that again. I think that's something that is just missing from so many of these places that especially survivors are going to get help. There's just like no accountability.
That's a really cool observation, actually. I mean, I do make sure now, if I'm out and about talking about this, I always mention that, because I think people need permission to say, actually, it's all right to say, yeah, I've harmed people, because I say it's easy to point the finger. So I always start by pointing the finger at myself. I've harmed people. I'm, man, white man. I'm sure I've psychologically harmed plenty of people of colour who have again not thought, oh my God, I've got to sit and listen to this white guy sort of shouting now. And it's really hard for me to be in this space. It's largely white people. If you're interested in doing a good job, and having sort of sense of purpose in the work, which I'm sure everybody should have, then I don't see what's so hard about thinking, well, I really got that badly wrong. And the thing is, it becomes one of your main relational sort of things you can lean on to say, you know what, I think I really got that badly wrong last time. I suggested something and I feel like I might have harmed you. I mean, sometimes people have shouted at me and said, you've really done this, which I'm like, well, okay, yeah, fair enough. But it's another key aspect of trauma-informed practice, if you get it right, which is that it's in the relational ruptures that more healing. I mean, I remember working with people for whom anger was really, really difficult because they'd never really been allowed to be angry. And just giving them a safe space to be angry at me and for me to say fair enough was really helpful for people. I think, well, actually, maybe anger's not this terrible toxic thing I've got to run away from, and maybe I've got a right to be angry. And maybe if I'm angry, it doesn't lead to the world being destroyed. It's fine, and I can still be valued as a human being. Because you come back from that and you can still have a normal chat about whatever it is, before you get into like the difficult stuff. So actually saying, I feel like I've harmed you, and offering that space for somebody to say, you did. Actually, I do feel harmed. Well, I want to try and, help, you move past that, what can we do? That's part of the magic of it, really. And I think that's just amazing, to have that kind of sense of human connection, So I think, again, it's part of the change. We need to move away from that very risk averse and like, we're always right. We can never admit to any mistake. Say, whoa, 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 whoa. We've been getting this badly wrong. Help us figure it out. Let's try and level the playing field, and let's kind of move forward. That's got to be a positive step, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's getting to that. You hear the word professional bandied around all over the place, don't you? And so we all like to think we're professional, but are you a reflective professional?
Mm.
Are you able to look in the mirror? Are you able to see your own stuff and what you're bringing to the table? And are you willing to kind of acknowledge that actually sometimes it's not helpful for the people that's in front of you, and that you have to check yourself in and your own ego, including me sometimes, and think, yeah, I wouldn't do it that way, I'll do it this way. And I don't say it to them because it's not for me to tell them how to do it. It's to say, here's the landscape in which you will find yourself, and these are the choices you may have, and these are the things you'll need to think about. But I can't tell you which one to choose because you're an individual. But you don't have to do it on your own. So again, it's coming back to, you don't have to do it on your own. And you can take your time, and you can be, and then learning yourself to kind of check yourself in and realize that you don't have all the answers, for instance. And if you're in human services, as my American colleagues might say, you're in the complex going to make mistakes business, because you're not in the software program. Even software programmers get wrong with the coding. So you're going to make mistakes because you're dealing with human beings. You're going to have the wrong nuance in the tone of your answer to somebody when they're waiting and expecting you, especially with survivors, because they're mind reading you all the time, which I think is what the problem is with a lot of professionals, because I think they know that they're constantly under scrutiny from the survivor, because the survivor is looking for all the cue points, the red flags to say, get out of here, because they're expecting it, they're preparing for it. Exactly. So there's a lot of transference going on as well. But if you kind of know how to navigate that, what happens is, and those who do it really well will know it, is the person kind of de-escalates from DEFCON 4 down to normal operating procedure. It's like you've got it's like they're just operating a normal base now because they feel safe. And it's because you're being safe with them. In the sense, you're being real, and what Roger's called authentic, isn't he? The kind of authentic practitioner, reflective practitioner, somebody who's just real but honest, but also there to do a job and to kind of help them to navigate the bureaucracy, for instance. Everyone has to fill forms in. It's a pain in the neck to fill forms in, but we have to have forms because we have to kind of have those. We insist that organisations need to have forms because they need to collect data, because they need to have all these other things. But the way you do it can be in a way that kind of acknowledges that it's a pain in the neck for everybody, but we have to do it without going too daft about it. But we need to do it. And then people say, yeah, whatever, let's fill them in. You say you have to fill a form in, or you can't come through the doorway, you're not complying, the people are going to stick two fingers up on you, aren't they? And they're going to stamp on it and leave. But if you kind of deal with it as the human beings you want to be, this is my way of doing it. If you deal with people as the way you want to be treated yourself, then actually that normally works quite. It doesn't work for everybody, but it normally works. It normally works with most people.
Absolutely.
Some people, and even the ones it doesn't work with, kind of acknowledge that maybe they're looking for something that maybe doesn't exist. And I was talking to a young guy recently, and all he's looking for is nobody provides that at the moment, because it can't be provided. You can get two parts of it, but you can't provide everything that he needs. So he then can't settle into anything because it's not everything that he needs. But maybe he doesn't really know what he needs because he keeps on cycling around. But you need to have a space where you can have that discussion with him in a real space. So people think I'm just kind of the king of digital, and I'm not the king of digital. I'm not a messiah for digital by any means. I think digital is a tool. I actually think for some people, what you need is these spaces where you can have long-term conversations like you, especially with survivors, long-term conversations over time, but they're not hiding from the trauma. That are kind of it's kind of visible on the walls, if you like. That actually, this is what we're talking about. This is what this space is all about, and therefore, you're free to talk about it, and we can navigate the conversation to a solution that works for you until you're ready and feel safe. Because safe might take a long, long time. If you've been abused endlessly in systems, it's going to take a long, long, long time for you to get and doing this stuff. So, where do you think you are with it, Richard, in these? Because it's a big city as you. And there's 6 or 7 representatives of the survivor community out there doing stuff with you, but they're not full time. So that's a big old task. So that's a big old task to help to kind of drive the conversation in a system that must employ. How many workers are employed in Leeds? It must be 20,000 workers. That's some stage, 10 to 15 easily, isn't it? Maybe we're kind of in direct frontline kind of services of one form or another. So how's excluding the police? So how's that going?
Another really good question. I mean, I suppose I have to stop myself just getting so frustrated and disempowered. I have to try and keep it simple. I think it's going all right. I mean, just going back to some of the things you were saying about it's safe. Somebody's got to feel safe. So you've got thousands and thousands of traumatized people, not just from childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence, from all sorts of things, domestic violence, people have come back from combat zones, all sorts of things, and they don't feel safe. And they're in spaces with professionals who are not making them feel safe, so they're making them feel unsafe. So I try to kind of boil it down to what's the most simple way to sort of address this problem? And when you're talking about reflective professionals that are going to look in the mirror, one of the simple bits of messaging we try to get across is we'll just try to make practitioners think, what are you taking into that space? Are you male? Are you white? What age are you? Are you young or are you older? What mood are you in? How disaffected do you feel by the fact that you've already had to do like hours of paperwork and your day's stretching on and you're distracted by thinking about what you've got to do at home? What are you taking into that space? And I don't know many practitioners actually bother to think about that. They just go into the space and armed with professional knowledge that doesn't really mean anything or is helpful to anybody a lot of the time. Sometimes it is, of course it is. It's not like, nursing degrees and stuff worthless, but just what's happening in that space. So I try, and I was saying to you before we started recording, but it's trying to sort of finesse the messaging, because you can write. We know what trauma-informed looks like. You can find thousands of articles and speak to thousands of survivors and say, this is what I need. But how do you make it stick, really? So to keep myself sane, I try and keep it as simple as that. It's like, well, how do you get that message across? You're going into a space, you're about to pick up the phone, or you're going into a space, wherever it is, with somebody that's distressed for whatever reason. Who are you in that space? I remember a survivor of very serious trauma once saying to me, I need professionals to make themselves into a blank piece of paper so I can write my story on it. Which again, it's like metaphor again. And it's like, that makes sense. Wow. I learned more from that than I would have done from going on a day's training, just from somebody saying it in that kind of way. So I thought, right, okay, so how can I make myself a blank piece of paper? I've got to get past my maleness. I might have to get past my whiteness. I might have to get past my age. I might have to get past the fact that I've got a Leeds accent and somebody finds that really difficult. I might have to get past the fact that I resemble somebody from somebody's past. How do I navigate all that in space, bring it into it, so that then I can be that blank piece of paper and that person can write their story on it and then they make sense of their own story. So how do you get that across? And if you can keep it as simple as that and in a way that people understand, I think that's where change can happen. I mean, maybe I'm being optimistic, but if you can get that message across and communicate it, and also communicate the fact that is magic, to do that in a space with somebody, we all yearn for that kind of sense of human connectedness. And even if you're doing it in a space where somebody's just suffered the most unimaginable things, but you're connecting, that's beautiful. That sense of human connection, even if you're connecting because of some terrible thing that's happened. It's a beautiful thing for us as practitioners or workers or whatever. So for me, it's about saying, okay, we've got minimal resources, visible benefits from having a reference group of people with lived experience of childhood sexual abuse. So, keep me honest, like, well, it's, if they keep, what the vision of the project's all about, very much in my mind. And I've got some lived experience people who've got experience of community mental health services. And it's about focusing, holding those kind of people up so that their voice is heard, and just saying what we already know, but in simple and meaningful terms that make people think, oh yeah, I see things a little bit differently now. And that is worth a million conferences, it's worth a million training days, and it's, not these are bad things, because they're really great things, but just that moment of dawning realization. So that's what I'm kind of aiming at, and that's why I think change is possible, because it really is simple as that. You've just got to get that message into people's heads so that they just think, just everything I've learned, as Yoda said, you must unlearn what you've learned. Getting them to do with that and take a step into the unknown, doing things a little bit differently, and just remembering you're a human being and that person there's a human being. When human beings come together, all sorts of magic things happen and difficult things happen. That's so interesting. That's what makes life, bearable, just that human connectedness. So I think if you think in those kind of terms, it's going all right, because I think more people are kind of catching on to that. And within it, there's a sense of like, this is going to make my life so much easier, because I can connect with people now without feeling like I've got to wade through 1,000,001 bits of paperwork and everything, or just my own frustration around that. But I mean, thinking more broadly, I think because, we were lucky to have commissioners that really backed Visible and want to see this change happening. And, Visible essentially has kind of pulled itself up by its own bootstraps, really. It's gone from something that nobody really knew about particularly, to now Visible's in charge of, embedding a trauma-informed working culture in Leeds, which just shows you that, it's possible. But you just need a few visionary thinkers to think, let's just put some money into something that's a bit different and something that is purely strategic. I don't have to worry about service delivery. I don't have to worry about staff or anything. I can just focus completely on strategic change and bringing that change, and just boxing clever, really, in terms of like thinking, well, what's possible? Let's think outside of the box a little bit. So maybe nothing will happen, but I feel optimistic. I think it's going quite well. There are people in the system in Leeds now who are thinking differently, who are willing to be challenged. And I think the core message is actually quite simple. Just getting it across.
So is it, just for example, we're in a moment of change. You're driving change in Leeds. And we're in a moment of change for our nation, really, because we've got a new government. And it's finding its feet, sometimes less firmly than perhaps some of us would hope for. But it's finding its feet, and it's got a direction of travel. So if the ministers who are going to be responsible for the next 5 to 10 years of something that's irreversible now, which is a trauma-informed kind of journey, just can't see how you can step back from it now. So what would you ask for them at this moment in time for them to gift to the leaders, the pioneers, the visionaries in Leeds, to help you to kind of drive forward the strategy change to the next level that you envision? Because if they may, I'm sure they won't be listening, but you never know, they might be. What would you ask them to do as something that will make this shift happen better for human beings? Because I don't think the human race, because the idea that the human race is here because we've all killed each other and fought each other to death and done all that, bloody crap. The reality is the human race is here because we collaborated.
Mm-hmm.
Without collaboration, our species would not have made it. Through all the natural disasters, all of history, all the plagues and everything else that have hit us. So, we saw a taste of that with the pandemic. And there have been worse pandemics for our species over time. So, so we only got here because we found a way to share the journey together to make the solutions to survive. And I think, that's a message that is really important to reinforce about especially at this moment in time. So what would you ask them for, Richard, for a city like Leeds? Not that I won't give you a big journey like the whole country, just for Leeds. Right. What would Leeds need from them to kind of take it to the next level and to give people empowerment at all levels in the system, from the worker to the decision maker, the commissioner, to you and your team, to actually shift it to the next level?
Well, I think if they are listening, I think they'd be glad to know I won't ask them for money, because I don't think there is any money. I mean, money would be good, please, in terms of, the very, very cash-strapped mental health system definitely needs money. We need money for, psychologists and so on, and therapists, because there's a lot of people that need long-term therapy. That's a whole other conversation, but I'm sure you'd agree.
Absolutely.
But I think what I would want is for them to adopt that kind of consistent message that I'm talking about, and just to model it. Really, I think what we need from leaders is for them to model the key attributes of kind of compassion, and openness and honesty, because we haven't had a lot of that in kind of politics, really.
Absolutely.
And I think, the sort of the apparent virtues of making money and business and, taking the brakes off to allow business. This is all kind of mechanistic, technocratic kind of thinking. So I would just want them to model basic human qualities of empathy and say, this is where we want, these are the kind of core foundational principles. I think a good quality society that looks after its most vulnerable citizens runs on good quality human relationships, and that doesn't cost anything. It's just about changing how you kind of think it. And I think I know that, as well as I do, there's a lot of awful people in society doing awful things, but probably the majority of people are just decent and want things to run smoothly and be okay. And if you can just harness that, you run the right roads. So I would just say, just understand this stuff a little bit better. Do your research. It's not hard to figure out that if somebody experiences unimaginable horrors as a kid, they're going to find adulthood difficult. So the whole. And I would also ask them. I would want them to challenge this whole thing of personal responsibility. Like people are just responsible for their own things and it's a meritocracy, and it's like, absolutely not. If you've experienced childhood sexual abuse, life's going to be hard, almost certainly for you. And what are your chances of just going and just, being able to make a load of money and just, set up your own business? Because people, that's hard for you, really, really tough and challenging. So get away from that meritocracy and personal responsibility. Accept that people do all sorts of things because bad things have happened to them. And just ask for a little bit more of just understanding. I mean, these things are very out of fashion because they don't chime with the capitalist patriarchal ethos, And there's a lot of people that want to keep these things hidden and want to say, well, that's just weakness and it doesn't oil the wheels of society and everything. But I would want, the people at the top to model something a little bit different. But actually, what we do need is more empathy. We do need more compassion, and we do need to think about ourselves as constantly, we're not much on our own. We're constantly in relationship with others, and in trauma-informed thinking, it's the quality of the relationship, not just with the practitioner and the service user that use that kind of language. It's the relationships of everybody at all times.
And you can't have a relationship with yourself unless you've been modelled to have a relationship with other people.
Yeah. Mm.
And if you've met the dysfunction of other people and you've internalized this dysfunction as longitude, sexual violence is a perfect example of that. Most survivors blame themselves and have guilt, and we kind of tick that box of everybody who comes through our service. Every single one says they felt guilt or one or the other or both, guilt and shame for what was done to them. And they always use the word, it happened to me. And you have to kind of reinforce it didn't happen to you, it was done to you, and you had no responsibility for it because you were chosen and targeted. That doesn't mean that you were responsible for it. It just means the person who did it is responsible for it. But they all kind of, and that's so you lose relationship with yourself. So, I kind of caused lots of ructions by reversing my name back to my childhood name. And it caused all sorts of waves for people. It's fascinating to watch. They couldn't get their head around the fact that I was no longer going to be called Bob. I was going to be called Rob, and they struggled with it. And they can't get around. And I would use that as an illustration now to say, actually, trauma in the best people were not the people I thought would deal with it well. The ones who I thought would deal with it really well because they were truly trauma informed are actually the ones who dealt with it in the worst way. They weren't very good at it. But the ones you thought would be really kind and struggle with it, oh yeah, no problem. How you doing, Mum? They didn't even think about it because they had a natural sense. If you want to call you by that name, it is your name anyway. So it's your thing, isn't it? It's nothing to do with me. And yeah, great. I'm not going to call you anything else. But people who were very educated, who exceptionally kind of regard themselves as truly trauma informed, struggled with it. They had to. It was almost like a subconscious pathologization going on about it. And all I did was decide to reverse to a name that half of the people who have known me in my life know me by, and the other half know me by another name, simply because I kind of chose to change it at a point in time to escape the guilt and the shame of my child. It's not complicated, is it? It's not hard. But people struggled with it. So I think your message to ministers, if they're listening, and who knows what ministers are listening to sexual violence strategy talks at this moment, but if they are listening, Jess Phillips, then, it is really about that message that you articulated exceptionally well. And I think I don't know Jess Phillips, but I kind of know enough about her to know that actually she'd resonate with that message, I suspect. And we'll kind of do that. But you get all the rest of them to kind of resonate with it. So they kind of do stuff. So they're all working together, but hopefully they're listening. Neve, have you got a final question? I'm going to keep forever, so I'm kind of doing the stuff.
I know. I think that message is maybe a good place to leave it on a nice positive note. I really enjoyed chatting to both of you. It's really interesting to hear you speak as well, Richard. You're very articulate. I hear you and I get you.
Thank you.
It's good.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to talk. Loved it. Yeah.
Thank you for coming on. And thank you to anyone who might be listening.
So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Thanks for having me. Bye from me.